I'll begin this presentation, A Photographic Friendship, James Ravilious and Chris Chapman, with a photograph that Simon Timms took of us. It was taken on the platform at Bristol Temple Meads on our way to the Royal Photographic Society in Bath, and James had been given an honorary fellowship for all the tremendous work that he'd done in North Devon over the years. Last September 2021, there was a wonderful private ceremony up in Chumley. The Devon History Society had decided to put one of their lovely blue plaques celebrating the life and times of the photographer James Ravilious, and I was invited to this ceremony. Robin had told me if I arrived early, please do come down to the house. I parked my car and I wandered down the street. I hadn't been there for quite a long time, and I suppose I was in a bit of a dream remembering James. And when I got to the door, my hand went for what I thought at first was the door pull. I was just about to pull it, thinking I was ringing a bell, when my eyes went up and I noticed to my horror that it was actually attached to the curtain. Had I pulled that curtain off, I think James would have found that absolutely hilarious. Anyway, my embarrassment was spared. Some of you will wonder why this little presentation is called A Photographic Friendship. Well, it's not a phrase that I coined. It was actually thought up by Ella Ravilious, James's daughter. And I think I can explain what it actually means, a photographic friendship. This is a picture of us both up in Wistman's Wood. Photography is a very solitary occupation. Most photographers equate themselves to being a little bit like a hunter. You're after a certain quarry, and in this case the quarry is the picture. And you really don't want anybody else with you. You want to be on your own. You don't want anybody else disturbing the peace and quiet or the thought processes. But with James, he was the most extraordinary man. He was an absolute delight to be with, and we both found that we could go out on these little photographic sorties together and not get in each other's way. And not only that, it was never ever competitive, and really I think that's why we enjoyed it so much. I was very surprised in putting together this little talk to come across this photograph of me taken by James in 1984, and I hadn't seen this picture before, and it came as something of a surprise when I came across it on the Beaford archive. I remember this day very, very clearly. James had rung me and told me that he wanted to take a picture of a medieval cross on Dartmoor, and seeing as it had snowed overnight, was there any possibility we could get up there? Well, I had a little Renault 4 at the time, which was a most amazing machine that would cope with snow, in fact cope with snow far better than any Land Rover. And so James found his way to the tithe barn in Throwley, and then we piled into my Renault and off we went. This was one of the first things that we came across climbing up onto the moor above Chagford, and we both got out and started taking pictures. I have to say, on this occasion, James got the better picture. Lovely to have one of me working, but also what's interesting is these are the pictures that I took, and really I was just that little bit too close. It's not really giving the sense of the steep hill where Courtney and his son Martin were rolling down the silage to feed their stock, whereas James very cleverly stood back. This is James with his painterly eye, and got what I think is the better picture. It shows the deep valley below Shapley Common, and I love the way Martin's arm is just out and not lost against the hawthorn tree. So in this instance, James got the better picture. Was I cross? No, I wasn't cross. I would admit to being envious, but we weren't competitive, and this was absolutely fine. But strangely, later in the day, the tables turned. I took him out to a favourite cross of mine, medieval cross known as Seward's Cross, sometimes called Nun's Cross, which is on the Monk's Path, which was a route across the moor from Buckfast Abbey to the Abbey at Tavistock. If you look very closely at this picture taken by me on a 35mm camera, you can see right in the far distance a tiny figure on the horizon to the left. And this turned out to be an elderly gentleman who was out strolling the moors on his way to Princetown. James was very busy fiddling with a newly acquired camera, a Mamiya 645, and he was getting quite cross with it. He didn't really like the way it operated. He taped it all up, didn't look too flashy, but he was struggling with it. And this gentleman arrived and he asked us what we were doing. And I said to him, well, we're trying to get a picture of this medieval cross in the snow. And without further ado, he walked over to it and said, oh, this old cross been here years. And he tapped it with his stick. And of course, the snow and the ice fell off. James was absolutely horrified and quite cross. And the old boy said goodbye and off he went, off on his walk back to Princetown. And I've always said the funniest picture of that day would have been James and I trying to stick the snow and the ice back on the cross so that we could take a photograph. And of course, it proved impossible. But later that day, I took him to Bennett's Cross, which is near the Warren House Inn, and this beautiful cross was equally attractive and was also covered in snow and ice, and he was delighted. You can see from this picture as well that we both respect each other's space. We're not getting in each other's way. There's none of my footprints in the virgin snow, and I simply left him to it. He wanted the picture to go on a cover of a poetry book, and I do remember him showing me this poetry book when it came out, but unfortunately the book is lost in time. We can't remember what it was called, who the poet was, or whether it was a number of poets. If anybody does ever come up with it, it would be lovely to see a copy. When we started work on the book, A Photographic Friendship, friends had come up with this idea that it was worth celebrating what in fact was James and I's 50th anniversary of starting our projects in Devon. I started to go back through my files and I found this lovely portrait of him, complete with blackberry and light meter and monopod and his camera bag, and I started to scratch my head because I couldn't quite remember where on earth it was taken. But I looked at the contact sheet and lo and behold, the very first photograph on that roll of film was of a Methodist chapel. So I scanned the negative, blew the resulting scan up as far as I could, and I could read that it was called Langham Cross Methodist Chapel. I did a little search on Google and found that that was in the parish of Dalton, and like so many of these chapels, not actually in Dalton itself, but some way out. And I rang Robin just to confirm I was in the right place, and of course indeed I was. But also what really shocked me was that I looked at this picture and I thought, actually, it's quite delightful. And so I made a print of it, and to my delight, this must have been a Sunday, I'm assuming it's a Sunday, and these three ladies with their flower pot hats walking towards me, probably just finished the service. And I thought, gosh, that's an extraordinary contrast to today, 1986, today, 2022. Now a very pretty private house with Felix roof lights and fireplaces and a smart garden surrounding it. Huge cultural change. And this is what photography, I believe, does so well. It documents our roots, it documents cultural change. And the steering group putting this book together, I made suggestions, but in fact most of the suggestions came from my colleagues, and so in the end I sort of let them get on with it, and they decided that they would do 25 pairings, and I found that quite interesting. It came as no surprise to me that James and I had a similar sense of humour, and so it was a lovely choice, these two pictures for the front and the back of the new book. This particular picture, which is the most beautiful, beautiful composition, taken early morning, John Moyes bottle feeding 2 lambs near Chumley. James said to me, I call this the tripod. And there, and we've all done it, there in the background is his tripod with another little camera on top. I've done that so many times and cursed. He must have thought the same. And we did laugh at similar things, and the magic of photography is that I think if you've got a sense of humour, that sense of humour will come out in your photographs. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. And my memory of this one in 1986 of Brian Mortimer and his own cooperative collie was down on a wall near Chagford Bridge on Dartmoor, and I was trying to do Brian's portrait with the dog looking at me, and they say never ever work with children or animals, and it was pouring with rain, and Brian has just said to the dog, look at the bloody camera. And when I looked at the contact sheets and looked at the sequence, this was the picture that just made me burst out laughing. I thought it lovely. Been a very popular picture over the years. We made a number of visits to Wistman's Wood. James was quite captivated by the place. And for those of you who don't know it, this is the remnants of an old forest, oak forest, up on High Dartmoor. It's quite possible that there were a number of these in years gone by. James really loved going there, and on this particular occasion, this was just a couple of years before he died, he was using a camera that Olive Cook had given him that one time had belonged to Edwin Smith. I was using a Pentax 6x7. I wasn't particularly inspired on this day, and I wandered off to have a look at a boulder further up on the north end of the wood, which has an inscribed story about the Prince of Wales in the 19th century allowing a tree to be cut down so that they could determine how old the trees in Wistman's Wood were. When I came back, I caught sight of James in the wood under his black cloth, and I just took one look and I thought, oh, bless him, and set my camera up on a tripod and took this picture. And I'm absolutely delighted with it. And just as a twist, my sense of humour, his sense of humour, I gave it to him and said, here you are, you're a man of the cloth. This is another occasion on Dartmoor in the winter of 1985, and James is using a 5x4 camera, and we climbed up onto Hookney Tor. I remember it being the most extraordinary light. He was very keen to use this large format camera. I've never seen the pictures that he took that day, and it was again only because of the book and because of the symposium at RAM on October the 1st that I started to search through my negatives and through my archive, and to my absolute delight I found this. So this is the view that he was trying to photograph, and I shall be intrigued to know whether he has this view on a 5x4 plate camera. I hope he does. Very difficult light to work with, as you can see. There's been a small smattering of snow, and I took him up there to show him the lynchets on Chalacombe Hill across the valley, but as you can see they're not quite discernible in my picture, so whether he got it or not I don't know, but wonderful light on the snaking road as it goes down the valley. And this picture of mine heading west down to Yarner Pits, taken in 2017. When I processed this picture and made a print, I was just thrilled with it, and I would have so loved to have shown this to James. It had what he was always trying to achieve, often would achieve, that sort of silvery light that you get at certain times of the day in the Devon countryside. And here on the right is a classic view taken by James, the view towards Iddesleigh and Dartmoor. He loved Iddesleigh, and he went back to this particular view again and again and again. And this is just the most beautiful picture that he took early one morning in 1985. So yes, had he been alive, I would have loved to have shown him my Yarner Pits. And the anniversary group came up with quite a few pairings. This one in particular works rather well, and you can see that we were photographing very similar subjects. There was certainly no copying going on. It was just the fact that he would be photographing away in North Devon and I would be doing something similar on Dartmoor, and we would share these pictures from time to time, show each other what we'd been up to. I was very envious of his commission at Beaford because I felt that would have just been a godsend to any photographer. He, on the other hand, would moan about it sometimes, that it wasn't terribly well paid, and he felt he was a little bit of a slave to it, perhaps. But I, on the other hand, would say to him, gosh, James, this is fantastic to be employed in the way that you're employed. You don't have to go out and do any commercial work. You can just be you 7 days a week. How fantastic is that? I was envious because to make a living, I was having to do commercial work, some of it very hard work. Did a lot of property photographs in the 1980s for some of the top-end estate agents, which was quite gruelling and punishing work. Very well paid, but hard work. James didn't have to do that. One of our mutual concerns was health, and health in the darkroom. And the first time I visited James at the little thatched cottage in Dalton, I told him straight that I was appalled at the stench inside his tiny darkroom. And in those days, he wasn't the cleanest of workers. He would print away in his darkroom with all these quite noxious chemicals. And if something wasn't right, he'd just throw the bad print under the workbench. And I remember there being a pile of these rather smelly, fumy prints. And I did say to him, that cannot be good for one's health. And I explained to him that down at the Tide Barn in Frowley, where I'd set up my darkroom, I had invested in a really good quality extractor fan. And eventually he did clean his act up. By the time he'd moved to Chumley, he'd got himself a very nice new darkroom in the attic space of the house, and he proudly showed me one day his extractor fan set up. He wasn't going to spend a load of money on a Ventaxia. I seem to remember this was a mask with a bit of vacuum hose or something similar connected to a Morphy Richards hairdryer, which didn't have the heating element in it, that hung on the outside of the door, so that he would constantly get fresh air to his lungs while leaning over the trays of chemicals. Very funny. And if you look at this picture, there are other things revealed. He used this De Vere 504 cold cathode enlarger, which you can see on the left. I had one of those for a number of years, but in the end I got rid of it because I found that it was terribly inconsistent on times. You would write down how long it took you to print a certain picture, and then a month later you might go back and print the same picture and the time was completely different. They had this sort of peculiar warm-up time that they needed. And whilst you could get quite a long range of tones out of your negative with it, I in the end ditched it and replaced it with a 5x4 Durst Laborator, which was a diffused enlarger. And quite honestly, I found that a better machine. But he kept on using the 35mm enlarger, which was the Light's 35mm enlarger, which you can see just behind his head. We did go to Wistman's Wood one day, and we had a relaxing day. And this is a lovely portrait that I took of James and his wife, Robin, in 1992. And I just find that a lovely picture, and it is so them. Robin obviously keen to do a little bit of bird watching, and for once, no sign of a camera round James's neck. Again, once this idea of the 50th anniversary had been announced, I was busy going through my archive, and to my great amusement, I found the following pictures. And you read here, on a visit to Addisford Cottage, Dalton, in 1984, James and I fell into conversation about the merits of using a 35mm single lens reflex camera, in this case my Olympus OM1, as opposed to his 35mm rangefinder, Leica, which I argued was far too slow. But rising to the challenge, the following sequence documents him proving that he could photograph a subject just as fast as me. So he went through this amusing performance of, I've just seen something. And he has his camera body out, he goes into the bag, he grabs a lens, he gets the lens fitted onto the camera ultra quick and shows off that he's got it on there ultra quick, and then swoops round to take a picture. During our careers, we're often accused of being sentimental ruralists, and we would find that accusation, I wouldn't say unsettling, but so off the mark about what we were doing. And I put these two pictures up to prove to you that James wasn't at all squeamish. Just like me, he would photograph everything there was to photograph in the countryside. That was our love, that was our interest, and that's what we would do. And here's my picture taken in 1991 of a hunted stag at Cloucham on Exmoor, and here is his picture cutting off the fox's brush at Hatherley in Devon in 1975. And in both instances we would probably find it quite difficult to take such a photograph today, but I think the pictures illustrate to our public that we were trusted photographers. We didn't have any political agenda. We photographed what was in front of us. We might have had an opinion, but it was more that we were documenting life in the countryside. And so these similarities crop up again and again. We haven't put them all in the book by any means. These next pictures aren't in the book, but I thought it was interesting following that theme of pairings, of how often we would document a very similar activity. This is my friend Charlie Mead in his vegetable plot in Merchington, which is part of my Throwley parish. Very interesting man. He got married, and something like a month later, his poor wife, she died of TB, and he stayed on his own for the rest of his life. And here is James's picture, the same activity, beautifully photographed in its context, digging a vegetable plot. I remember this occasion, 1995, and James had come to my house. By then I'd moved up to Wonson in the village of Throwley, a little hamlet called Wonson. And above Wonson is a beautiful bit of common land called Ash Green with a lovely brook running through it. So we wandered up there and we were talking about doing each other's portrait for book jackets, and that's what we did. So I took this picture of James by the stream, and then he took this one of me with my collie. I showed you earlier on the wonderful landscape of the view to Iddesleigh with Dartmoor beyond, and in the churchyard of St James, Iddesleigh, there is a memorial to James, and it's rather fitting because it actually encourages you to stand in almost exactly the same place as he would to admire the view. And that same year, probably the same day that we did each other's portraits on Ash Green, I took this. It's blackberry time, so we're talking late August, September. And James made me laugh. He kept picking these blackberries and enthusing about how tasty they were. And I managed to capture his enthusiasm in this particular picture. But on another occasion, the very last picture that I'm going to show you, our friend Peter Beecham, who did that beautiful book with James, the last book in fact, during his lifetime, Down the Deep Lanes. I told Peter about this ruined medieval chapel that lies between Throwley and Gidley, and a remarkable place, and I wanted to show them both the chapel. And so we wandered up from my house, and very unusual for me to have a colour film in my camera, but that particular day I did, and this is the one that I took of him. And I have to say, of all the photographs I've taken of him, somehow this one for me tells you all you need to know about James Ravilious. He was a lovely man and a wonderful friend.